Welcome to the Concealed Taco Dudes podcast. Today we have yet another episode of Storytime with Jason. I've got something really cool for you today. Before we jump into that, I'm going to knock out our sponsors real quick. Make sure you support these guys because they're the ones who support us and they just make great stuff. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about them. So make sure you go check out NOE Bullet Molds at noebulletmolds.com, Utah Air Guns at utahairguns.com, Black Ice Coatings at blackicecoatings.com. All these guys you can find on Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that as well. Don't forget to check out Magholder at magholder.com and Concealment Solutions at concealmentsolutions.com. That's our sponsors. They take care of us and they will take care of you as well. So go check them out. I have 2 books today on the same person that we're going to go over and read some excerpts from, and hopefully you'll find it as interesting as I did. Today we're going to be talking about Audie Murphy. A lot of you probably already know who that is. For those of you who do not, he is the most decorated soldier of World War II. Audie Murphy was born in 1925 in Texas, grew up during the Depression, and because of such, had a pretty hard life growing up. His father left the family, never really supported him very well to begin with. Mother died when he was very young and kind of left him to kind of care for the family as best he could. I believe the younger siblings ended up going into the orphan system, and he kind of bounced around in Texas and worked and tried to support himself and his siblings as best that he could. Always wanted to join the military. When he was 17 was when the World War II was beginning, and he was super anxious to get into that and to go to war. He had an older mentor, I guess best way to put it, somebody that he worked for that he looked up to that had been in the military and talked a lot about it, and so I think he respected that and wanted to follow in his shoes and was anxious to join the military. So he tried to join the Marine Corps and the Navy and the Army, and they all turned him down because he said he was underage, which he was, and he was too small. He was 5'5" and weighed 112 pounds. Not the typical image that you think of when you think of the most decorated soldier in World War II. So he went back to the drawing board, put on a little bit of weight, and had his older sister write a letter confirming his birth date, which was falsified to make him old enough to join the military. Finally got the Army to take him, and thus began his military career. He enlisted in 1942 at the age of 17, thanks to his sister's help. Now, the 2 books that we're going to talk about, one is called To Hell and Back, which was written by him, co-authored, I think, with somebody else, and I can't remember the name. Anyway, he had some help writing it, but it's very well written. This guy did not have, I don't know that he even finished high school, despite that fact, super intelligent, and really quite articulate. The book is written very, very well, and maybe that had something to do with the help that he had in writing it, but either way, it reads very well, very good story, and it's firsthand accounts of the battles and the things that he went through during World War II. He served in France and Italy, I believe. Anyway, really a good read. But so he's the most decorated soldier in World War II, and he talks about all these battles and these amazing things that he accomplished and did during the war. But I don't remember one time him mentioning, oh yeah, after this battle I was awarded, this medal, and then I got this medal for this one. he doesn't even talk about that at all. And so I finished reading it, and it kind of left me wanting a little bit. I'm like, well, there's something missing from this story. As great as it was to read, I just felt like I wasn't getting the complete story. And so I found another book that is written by David A. Smith, and it is entitled The Price of Valor. And it talks about Audie Murphy's life before his military career, carries all through the military, and his post-military life. So he went on, when he got out of the military, he had a very long movie career. He was an actor. He was also a songwriter and a few other things, which is pretty interesting. I think the most interesting thing of that, he was kind of pressed into, Audie Murphy was kind of pressed into writing his autobiography, To Hell and Back. It wasn't something that he wanted to revisit. He wanted to kind of put that in the past and move on with his life, as one would expect. Rehashing those stories and the loss of friends and the trauma that he went through, both mentally and physically, you can understand that. Yeah, why would you want to rehash that and relive it? But through persuasion from a friend, he wrote the book. Then when he got into acting, he was again pressed into playing himself in the lead role in the movie To Hell and Back. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for him. For those of you who have served military and have experienced war, to have to go back and reenact the most horrific moments of your time, I just can't imagine. I just can't imagine how that would have been for this guy. Well, the book that David A. Smith writes, The Price of Valor, dives into that aspect of things very much. Because after reading To Hell and Back, you kind of get the impression that, I had this hard life as a kid, and I went to war, and that just kind of clicked with me, and I was able to accomplish these great things, and then I came home and lived happily ever after. That wasn't exactly how it played out. And The Price of Valor sheds some light on that very much. But anyway, let's get into... I'm going to read a few sections. I have so much stuff marked that I want to share with you. I don't know if it's realistic to do it all, but I'm going to read some stuff here to you that I think you'll like. This is all really, really good stuff. Okay, we are going to start here toward the beginning of The Price of Valor. So, it says, Audie grew up hunting, mostly as a way to secure meat for the dinner table. As a young boy, he could hit and kill a running rabbit with a rock. He quickly graduated from rocks to slingshots to then a .22 rifle, and with each weapon he displayed remarkable aim against squirrels, rabbits, and birds, sometimes seeing targets no one else could spot. His hearing was just as sharp as his eyesight, and he could locate a squirrel in a tree just from the sound of a cracking twig. While he was tracking down a squirrel or a bird completely focused in the moment, he was truly content. One relative later recalled that about the only fun he ever had was hunting. John Cawthon was an avid dove hunter, and because his own sons did not like to hunt, he took Audie with him. Once Audie disappeared over the crest of a hill, and Cawthon heard multiple blasts from a shotgun. He returned to find Audie surrounded by so many doves that they exceeded the state limit. His marksmanship may seem legendary, but there was an undeniable reason for him to be a good shot. If I missed, we didn't eat, he said. He also knew that he couldn't afford enough bullets to be a bad shot. Audie's other ideas of fun were dangerous in the extreme. He and his friends shot beer bottles off each other's heads and shot sticks and cigarettes out of their hands in what they called Hunt County Roulette. It was foolhardy, but a friend remembered that Audie had great courage and always accepted a challenge. Audie had supreme confidence in his ability to put a bullet precisely where he wanted it, and his trusting, willing friends must have shared that confidence. That sounds like an accident waiting to happen, but, we don't do stuff like that nowadays. Just like a lot of the people we've talked about, the military greats, he started off, hunting and providing for himself and his family because that was the only means they had. He had to be a good shot or they went hungry. Now moving on, he's in his military training. It says, one day during a bayonet drill, he suddenly passed out. The Texas summer heat had risen well over 100 degrees, and he had just received a series of immunizations, which probably had something to do with it. He spent a couple of days in the camp hospital before rejoining his company. The episode was not serious, but it hinted at a vulnerability. Audie's health was always somewhat frail. He was prone to sickness. The vulnerability and his small size prompted his commanding officers to suggest he switch training tracks and become a cook or something like that. Audie refused and stuck to his intention of becoming an infantryman. He kind of had a sickly constitution, I guess, and his officers, recognizing that and his small stature and all that, were like, man, this guy, infantry, he'll be dead in the first hour we send him out. Let's do him a favor, reassign him somewhere else. He wanted nothing to do with it. That happened more than once before he entered the military theater, and he flatly refused anything but infantry. That says something about his character as well. He joined Company B. This is getting into the war now. This is Company B. So now we're getting into some of the combat stories that are really fascinating. He says Company B met its first real resistance near the village of Campobello, and Murphy came under direct and sustained enemy fire. On July 13th, 1943, his platoon was pinned down by machine gun fire on a dusty hillside. Suddenly he jumped up and started firing from the hip, charging at the enemy and yelling for the rest of the men in the platoon to follow him. He was that kind of soldier, said his platoon commander. 2 days later he was promoted to corporal and given frontline duty, which is exactly what he wanted. You may have to take over a squad, his captain warned him. Bill Muldoon, who drew one of the most famous comic strips of the war, Willie and Joe, said that in war, nobody really knows what he's doing. If he had seen Audie Murphy in action, he might have thought differently. Murphy had an instinct for combat. If I discovered one vulnerable thing during my early combat days, Murphy said, it was audacity. If he learned one valuable thing during my early combat days, it was audacity, which is often mistaken for courage or foolishness. It is neither. Audacity is a tactical weapon. 9 times out of 10, it will throw the enemy off balance and confuse him. However much one sees of audacious deeds, nobody really expects them. They are not in the rule books. I found that retreating was the most dangerous maneuver possible. If you have no defense, attack. That kind of sheds light on some of the things we've talked about recently about the element of surprise and doing the unexpected, and he that's over and over and over again. That was common in Audie's military career, and just some of the crazy, amazing things that he was able to accomplish. Here's another account that will support that. It says Murphy was ascending Pillbox Hill when he heard the crack of a rifle shot and saw the GI in front of him fall dead. Murphy hit the dirt as bullets zinged past him. He saw that if he rolled into an adjacent gully, he could continue up the hill beneath the rifle fire and find and take out the enemy. Staying low and moving fast, he rounded a slight bend in the ditch and came face to face with 2 German soldiers. In their shock, they hesitated. Murphy did not and killed them both. When I get in a situation where it's tense and everything, he remarked later, things seem to slow down for me. It doesn't seem to blur. Things become very clear. The men he had killed had probably been looking for him, and in the meantime, enemy fire kept pouring down. Murphy recognized he needed more firepower. He scurried down the hill, appropriated a light machine gun from a crew that was pinned down and refused to move, and then returned up the ditch, dragging the gun behind him, until he found a position where he could target the German foxholes. He intended to take advantage of something he recognized instantly. Because the Germans were firing downhill at a depressed angle, their rifle stocks would be higher than their muzzles, and any German taking aim at him would have to expose his head, giving Murphy a chance of a shot. I judged the range, pressed the trigger, and turned the stream of lead on anything that remotely resembles a kraut. Scrambling quickly to the foxhole, or even just a low spot in the ground, after each time he squeezed the trigger of his machine gun, he slowly worked his way up the hill. Before he reached the top, he ran out of ammunition and, staying low, hurried back down the hill for more. So he's running up and down this ravine while everybody else is just hunkered down below watching what's happening, I guess. Laddie Tipton, bleeding profusely from a bullet that had hit him in the ear, finally caught up with Murphy at this point, and the two of them, taking turns covering each other, advanced, firing from the hip and hurling grenades into enemy gun emplacements. Suddenly there was silence. Murphy and Tipton were crouched in a foxhole, their weapons trained on the next enemy emplacement. A German voice shouted, "Comrade!" Tipton warily stuck his head above the ground to take a look. "They're waving a handkerchief," he said with relief. "I'll go get them." Murphy urged him to stay down. The Germans could not be trusted. "You're getting to be a cynic," Tipton responded, standing up. A single shot from an unseen sniper hit him in the chest and sent him tumbling back into the hole atop his buddy. Murphy frantically tried to find a pulse while screaming for a medic, but as Murphy conceded, "I might as well be shouting at the moon, and the hill is rattling with fire." "I never saw a drop of blood on him," Murphy said. "The sniper bullet must have hit him in the heart." For the first time in the entire war, he later admitted, he refused to face facts, swearing that Tipton was not dead. He counterattacked like a berserker, bursting from his foxhole, firing his carbine. He killed the two Germans who had been shooting at him, grabbed their machine gun, and holding it like a BAR for firing from the hip, Murphy found the gun crew that had killed Tipton and raked them with fire. "I remember the experience as I do a nightmare. A demon seems to have entered my body, a demon that led him to clean out the entire hill of Germans. When the stress finally passed and the rush of adrenaline left his body, his hands began to tremble and he sank to the ground exhausted." The remainder of his company followed slowly in Murphy's wake, unsure if he were a hero or simply crazy. "Murphy just lost his head," a buddy commented. "When you lose a buddy like that, it's really tough." When Murphy regained his feet, he made his way back to his lifeless friend. He took Tipton's pack and placed it under the dead man's head as though it were a pillow, and then collapsed beside him, crying uncontrollably. It was the first and only time any of the other men in the company saw him cry. "In this tiny section of France, the war is over," Murphy wrote later. "Above us, white clouds float beneath a roof of pure blue. It is just another summer day." For his courage in taking the hill, Audie Murphy received the Distinguished Service Cross. Crazy. This was a good friend of his that died, and he went nuts and took out every machine gun crew on that hill, some of them using one of their own machine guns. That was just kind of the way he operated. I think he was known to have a bit of a temper, and that comes out later in The Price of Valor. And that was evident, I think, in a lot of what he did in his military career. It played to his advantage, you know. Later in his life, it did not, unfortunately, and he had some trouble with the law a little bit, had some failed marriages and things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get on. Now I'm switching to hell and back, so these are going to be Audie's words describing some of the battles and some of the things that he experienced firsthand. He said, "The first major task of my company is to cut the railroad running south of Cisterna. The Germans have dug in along its sides, and the track bed is protected by a lashing stream of automatic fire. We pause behind a high stone wall to reconnoiter and coordinate the movements of our 3 platoons. The track in this section passes through a deep cut. To cross, we must slide down the bank, sprint over the bed, and clamber up the opposite slope. To our right, near a concrete culvert, the Germans have 2 machine guns trained directly toward the cut through which we must run." Valero attempts to knock out the weapons with a Browning automatic. He bores into the emplacements with spurts of lead, but the guns are too strongly shielded to be silenced by small arms. We always think of a BIR as a big, imposing gun, which it is, but it is a small arm in a battlefield. Meanwhile, important moments slip by. The first platoon begins the crossing, and the enemy guns are strangely quiet. The second platoon goes over. I crawl to the edge of the cut, turn and wave my men forward at a time, one at a time. Johnson, when Horseface reaches the roadbed, he leaps the tracks and scrambles up the embankment with bullets singing about him. At the top, he twists his head toward me, thumbs his nose, and wriggles off on his belly. A crackle of mass fire begins on the opposite bank. I have the sudden, sickening feeling that we're being lured into a trap, but I cannot hesitate. Brandon, Jones, Valero, Flack. For some unaccountable reason, the young corporal pauses in the cut. It is only for an instant, but down the tracks the Germans press their triggers. Flack drops to his knees, then crumples across an iron railing. Burner, Cole, Bergman, Kerrigan. I am the last. Scanning the banks, I pick my path, draw a deep breath, and start sliding. The handle of a trench shovel fastened to my pack wedges between 2 protruding rocks, and I hang like a pigeon upon the bank with lead spattering all about me. Rock dust from the bullets fills my nostrils. My throbbing temples seem ready to burst. Glancing up, I see the look of horror on Kerrigan's face. He gets up, measures the distance to me with his eyes, and tenses his muscles for the jump. Yelling for him to keep down, I free myself with a desperate heave and bolt across the tracks. Sweat stands on Kerrigan's brow. "You ignorant bastard," he spits. "Are you hurt?" "No, just a slight heart attack and a nervous breakdown." "Why the hell didn't you look to see where you were going?" "I was interested in the scenery." "Come on." A low rock wall parallels this side of the track also. Along it, the panting men lie with their heads in the crooks of their arms. A German machine gun rips the air. Bergman raises his head to investigate. A sniper's bullet clangs against his helmet, spinning him around without knocking it off his head. Cautiously, he feels for blood. Another bullet shatters the stock of his rifle. "Jesus Christ," he exclaims. "They got no respect for my equipment." The first bullet had lodged between his helmet and its liner, but by freakish luck he had not been scratched. We roll over the wall and find ourselves in the range of 2 enemy strong points, but for the moment the Krauts are ignoring us. They are absorbed in trying to split the 2 groups of men that preceded us. A sergeant in the first platoon senses the predicament. If his men are isolated, they will likely be destroyed. He makes his decision quickly. Motioning his men to follow, he rises, and with a submachine gun charges head-on toward one of the enemy positions 200 yards away. On the flat, coverless terrain, his body is a perfect target. A blast of automatic fire knocks him down. He springs to his feet with a bleeding shoulder and continues his charge. The guns rattle. Again he goes down. Fascinated, we watch as he gets up for the 3rd time and dashes straight into the enemy fire. The Germans throw everything they have at him. He falls to the earth, and when he again pulls himself to his feet, we see that his right arm is shattered. But wedging his gun in his left armpit, he continues firing and staggering forward. 10 horrified Germans throw down their guns and yell, "Comrade!" That is all I see. But later I learn that the sergeant, ignoring the pleas of his men to get under cover and wait for medical attention, charged the second enemy strong point. By sheer guts, he advanced 60 yards before being stopped by a final concentration of enemy fire. He reeled, then tottered forward and another few yards before falling. Inspired by his valor and half insane with rage, his men took over, stormed the Kraut emplacement, and captured it. When they returned to their leader, he was dead. This was how Lutsky, the sergeant, helped buy the freedom that we cherish and abuse. Very poetic right there. I thought that was just insane what these guys are putting themselves through. Here's another one. We're just going to keep going. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I see the Germans lining up for an attack. 6 tanks rumble to the outskirts of Holzwehr, split into groups of 3, and fan out toward either side of the clearing. Obviously, they intend on encircling movement, using the fingers of trees for cover. I yell to my men to get ready. Then wave after wave of white dots, barely discernible against the background of snow, start crossing the field. They are enemy infantrymen wearing snow capes and advancing in a staggered skirmish formation. One of our tank destroyers starts its engine and maneuvers for a firing position. It slides into a ditch at an angle that leaves the turret guns completely useless. The driver steps on the gas, the tank wallows further into the ditch, and the engine dies. The crew bails out and takes off for the rear. "I'm trying to contact headquarters," shouts the artillery observer. I had forgotten about him. "We cannot afford to have the radio captured." "Get to the rear," I holler. "I'll get the artillery by phone. I don't want to leave you. Get going. You can't do any good. Just take care of that radio." I grab a map, estimate the enemy's position, and seize the field telephone. "Battalion," cheerfully answers a headquarters lieutenant. "This is Murphy. We're being attacked. Get me the artillery." "Coming up." I want a round of smoke at coordinates 30.5-60 and tell those Joes to shake the lead out. "How many Krauts?" 6 tanks that I can see and maybe a couple hundred foot soldiers supporting. "Good God, how close?" "Close enough. Give me that artillery." I hang up the receiver and grab my carbine just as the enemy's preliminary barrage hits. It is murderous. A single tree burst knocks out our machine gun squad. The second tank destroyer is hit flush and 3 of its crew are killed. The remainder, coughing and half blinded, climb from the smoking turret and sprint down the road to the rear. At that moment I know that we are lost. The smoke shell whizzes over, landing beyond the oncoming Germans. 200 right, 200 over, and fire for effect. Our counter barrage is on the nose. A line of enemy infantrymen disappear in a cloud of smoke and snow, but others keep coming. The telephone rings. "How close are they?" 50 over, and keep firing for effect. That artillery curtain must be kept between us and the enemy. The tanks are now close enough to rake our position with machine gun fire. Of the 128 men that begin the drive, not over 40 remain, and I am the last of 7 officers. Trying to stop the armor with our small arms is useless. I yell to the men to start pulling out. "What about you?" shouts Cole. "I'm staying up with the phone as long as I can. Get the men back and keep them grouped. Candler will help you." "Candler's dead." Telephone rings. "How close are they?" 50 over, and keep blasting. The company's pulling back. I raise my eyes and see that the men are hesitating. Clapping down the receiver, I yell, "Get the hell out of here. That's an order." Cole says something, but his words are lost in a shell burst. He shrugs his shoulders, beckons with his thumb, and the men stumble through the woods, casting worried glances backward. I seize my carbine and start sniping. The advance wave infantryman is within 200 yards of my position. The telephone rings. "How close are they?" 50 over. Keep it coming. Dropping the receiver, I grab the carbine and fire until I give out of ammunition. As I turn to run, I notice the burning tank destroyer. On its turret is a perfectly good machine gun and several cases of ammunition. The German tanks have suddenly veered to the left. I change my plans and drag the telephone to the top of the tank destroyer. The body of the lieutenant with whom I talked earlier in the morning is sprawled over the edge of the hatch. His throat has been cut. A small river of blood streams down the side of the tank destroyer. I finish dragging the body out and dump it into the snow. The telephone rings. How close are they? 50 over. Keep firing for effect. How close are they to your position? Just hold the phone and I'll let you talk to one of the bastards. Hastily checking the machine gun, I find that it has not been damaged. When I press the trigger, the chatter of the gun is like sweet music. 3 Krauts stagger and crumple in the snow. Crash! The tank destroyer shudders violently. Vaguely, I put 2 and 2 together and conclude that the TD had received another direct hit. The telephone rings. This is Sergeant Bowes. Are you still alive, Lieutenant? Momentarily, I spread the map on my left palm. Correct fire. Crash! I am conscious of a flash and explosion. I reel back with the map and telephone receiver in my hands. Lieutenant, can you hear me? Are you still alive, Lieutenant? I think so. Correct fire. 50 over, and keep the line open. I feed another belt of cartridges into the machine gun and seize the trigger again. The smoke is so thick that I can barely see through it, and the smell of smoldering flesh is again in my nostrils. But when the wind blows the smoke aside, I bore into any object that stirs. The gun has thrown the Krauts into confusion. Evidently, they cannot locate its position. Later I am told that the burning tank destroyer loaded with gasoline and ammunition was expected to blow up any minute. That was why the enemy tanks gave it a wide berth and infantrymen could not conceive of a man's using it for cover. I do not know about that. For the time being, my imagination is gone, and my numbed brain is intent only on destroying. I am conscious only that the smoke and the turret afford a good screen, and that, for the first time in 3 days, my feet are warm. Now the Germans try a new tactic. A gust of wind whips the smoke aside, and I see an enemy sergeant in the roadside ditch not 30 yards from my position. He peers cautiously about, then turns his head and motions his squad forward. As I spin my gun barrel upon him, a billow of smoke comes between us. For a minute or so I wait. The tree branches overhead stir stiffly in the gust. The smoke column folds to one side. The 12 Germans, huddled like partridges in the ditch, are discussing something, perhaps my possible location. I press the trigger and slowly traverse the barrel. The 12 bodies slump in a slack position. I give them another methodically thorough burst and pick up the phone. Correct fire, battalion, 50 over. Are you all right, Lieutenant? I'm all right, Sergeant. What are your post-war plans? The barrage lands within 50 yards of the tank destroyer. The shouting, screaming Germans caught in it are silent now. The enemy tanks, reluctant to advance further without infantry support, lumber back toward Howitzer. I snatch the telephone receiver. Sergeant Bowes, correct fire, 50 over, and keep firing for effect. This is my last change. 50 over? That's your own position. I don't give a damn. 50 over. Concussion from the enemy barrage almost knocks me from the tank destroyer. For a moment I am stunned, and then I see the telephone receiver in my hand. Sergeant Bowes, battalion, sergeant. There is no answer. The telephone line has been knocked out. My cloudy brain slowly directs my actions. Carefully I fold the field map and notice that it has been riddled with shell fragments. I examine my hands and arms. They are unscratched. A dull pain throbs in my right leg. Looking down, I see that the trouser leg is bloody. That doesn't matter. As if under the influence of some drug, I slide off the tank destroyer and without once looking back, walk down the road through the forest. If the Germans want to shoot me, let them. I am too weak from fear and exhaustion to care. That is pretty incredible. And watching it in the movie To Hell and Back kind of puts it into perspective a little bit. Pretty cool stuff. So both these books are filled with stories like that. There is no lack of excitement, for sure. But I don't want to ruin it all for you. You really should read these yourself. They're very well worth the read. So we're going to move on to... Well, he's got one more quote here in regards to the war, and then we're going to move into kind of the post-war stuff. But he says, the phrase, "if I live," becomes less common. The early March sun hangs overhead, and beneath it men carefully cleaning their weapons again talk of home. I have seen too much to grow optimistic. The road across Germany is a long one, and each mile of it must be bought with somebody's blood. Why not mine? My luck has been extraordinary, but there is an end even to the extraordinary. So until the last shot is fired, I will go on living from day to day, making no post-war plans. And I think that's kind of a common sentiment among soldiers in wartime. I marked this little paragraph because it's kind of a window into his personality. He says, turning to my pack in search of a necktie, I spy my service pistol, which would have been in 1911. Automatically, I pick it up, remove the clip, and check the mechanism. It works with buttered smoothness. I weighed the weapon in my hand and admire the cold blue glint of its steel. It is more beautiful than a flower, more faithful than most friends. I think that's great. Just his kind of an extensive gun collection. He loved guns. I mean, he grew up with them. They provided for him. Obviously, during the war, they saved his life and many others. So he had a definitely a special connection with guns. So we're going to move on to post-war life. And so we're going to jump back to The Price of Valor by David A. Smith. He says, Hollywood also read about the adventure Murphy had in December 1946 on a visit home to Texas. This is, again, post-war. He's kind of a Hollywood celebrity to some degree, even if a minor one. And so he's in the tabloids and whatnot. And here's a story that surfaced through that. It said Murphy had picked up a hitchhiker near the little town of Vickery. He was a big man wearing what looked like an army jacket, and after getting in the front seat, he jammed a jacketed hand into Murphy's side, saying he had a gun. Murphy twice told him to pull his hand away, and when he did not, Murphy stopped the car and pummeled him. He then drove to a nearby gas station and called his highway patrol friend to come help him out. So, picks up a hitchhiker who decides he's going to rob him by pretending he has a gun. I think we can assume that this guy was much bigger than Murphy. Didn't matter. Murphy took care of business and took him out of the scene. And there's some staged pictures, I think, of him talking with police afterwards and stuff like that made the papers and all of that. But I thought that was pretty cool. Kind of reminded me back to Storytime when we were the Deadly Men, I think, had the cab driver that carried a gun and took care of business with guys that wanted to rob him. Anyway, thought that was pretty cool. Now we're going to start getting into the dark side of what this war, the effect of this war on Murphy, and the lack of mental health in this time in the period of our country and in the military. He says Audie Murphy also liked guns, while Hendricks, which was, I believe, his first wife, came to fear them, most especially in his hands. His gun collection was the big thing in his life, and he cleaned them every day and, as she later said, caressed them for hours. Who wouldn't? He slept with a loaded gun under his pillow and alarmed her with his screaming nightmares about combat. When they had arguments, she said he sometimes pulled out a gun and aimed it at her before turning it around and putting it in his mouth. He fired guns in the house, shooting clocks off the wall, shooting mirrors, shooting light switches. Once during their separation, he shot the lock off the door of their apartment just to show her he could get in any time he wanted. In February 1950, she filed for divorce, citing mental cruelty as the reason, and justifiably so, I think. Mr. Murphy's war record is well known, said the judge as he gavelled the marriage to an end, and I am sure it contributed a great deal to his attitude. I think alluding to what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder for sure. He had the most beautiful smile, Wanda Hendricks said years later, but unfortunately he never smiled much. Audie Murphy was, she said, an ancient young man. Murphy's friend David McClure was blunter in his assessment. It is generally assumed that Audie easily readjusted to civilian life, making a fortune as a movie star and living relatively happily ever after. Almost the reverse is true. Let us hope that God did forgive him. His battered nervous system never did. And I think that's that's the unfortunate reality of this guy's life, unfortunately. Moving on, he says, but as he traveled from city to city with Murphy, Frank McFadden became aware of things that the general public never saw. One night, there was a mix-up in the hotel reservations, and the traveling company all had to share rooms. This is, they're traveling for a movie shoot, I believe. He and Murphy bunked together in a double. When Murphy took off his sport coat in the room that evening, it was the first time McFadden realized that he always carried a gun with him. He watched as Murphy took the gun, a small revolver, out of its holster and slipped it under the pillow on his bed. At about 2 a.m, McFadden was abruptly wakened by a terrible racket. To his shock, Murphy was up and pounding the wall next to his bed with his fist so hard that they were starting to bleed, but he remained sound asleep. He gently tried to wake him up by repeatedly calling his name, and Murphy slowly came to his senses. Without a word, he went into the bathroom and washed the blood from his hands. I had a dream, he said simply when he re-emerged and got back into his bed and went to sleep. McFadden was so deeply shaken by the experience. While they remained friends and continued to travel together and work with each other after that night, he never slept in the same room with him again. When the cavalcade rolled into Dallas, the two took a break from the schedule of appearances and went hunting on some land owned by a friend of Murphy's. Only there did he seem to relax noticeably and genuinely enjoy himself. He was happy on a ranch when he was around ranch people, McFadden concluded. That's when he was really Audie. And he talks about how, as much as he did enjoy the Hollywood, kind of the making the movies and the attention and the money and things like that, he never really was comfortable with the Hollywood lifestyle and the people. He really could not relate to the people at all, and that became a problem in various instances. Going on, this is Murphy talking. He says, war robs you mentally and physically, he said with clinical detachment. It drains you. Things don't thrill you anymore. It's a struggle every day to find something interesting to do. After 2 or 3 years of combat, it does something to you, he added, but it takes a while to realize what it has done to you. He thought the Army, which he otherwise loved, should have done more to help veterans readjust to civilian life. Our war dogs were detrained after the war, he said, but not the soldiers. I found that really interesting, that the dogs that they used in war, that were trained to attack and to do whatever various jobs, before they reintroduced them back into life in the States, they had to go through a series of detraining to work that dangerous aspect, I guess, out of the dog so that they could be healthy in the community again, not be a problem. But the soldiers, they did nothing. And I think, we can look back on it and think, God, what a terrible thing that the military, didn't care enough about their soldiers and the men and women that had to deal with this kind of stuff to try and take care of them. But we have to also realize that mental health concerns and issues were very, very different back then, and what we know now they didn't know then. And so, it's hard to be judgmental. It's discouraging and sad to know that somebody that did so much for their country was at the same time kind of let down by them. But I think that's still an area that needs to improve. I know I have friends that had to deal or are dealing with post-traumatic stress from serving in the military and things like that, and they do get a lot of help and a lot of treatment, and there's a lot of resources out there now that there weren't back then, but I think there's still more that can be done. And so, anyway, let's move on. It says, in the mid-1960s, Audie Murphy seemed increasingly out of touch with the leftward drift of American popular culture. His heroism in World War II and the public celebration of that heroism now looked more antiquated than praiseworthy. But even if the culture was changing, Murphy was not. He had no sympathy with the anti-Vietnam War movement and the draft protesters, and his response was to continue to trumpet the virtues of military service. There is a growing tendency to regard military service as an onerous chore rather than an exciting opportunity, he said late in the decade. The chance to serve one's country is a high privilege, not a wearisome sacrifice. He exhorted Americans not to downgrade the noble profession which guarantees our freedom. And I think we see that even now. I think military service is not looked on like it was during the World War II times. It's very different. It was almost like an obligation back then, and now to some degree, in some circles, it's almost even looked down upon as something that is only meant for the weak-minded and those that, can't do anything else. Go be a grunt in the military, and that's sad. It's sad that there is that sentiment at all regarding our military, because it is definitely not that way. There are some fantastic opportunities that the military provides. And yeah, it is an honor to serve your country. Last section here. It says, almost without fail, people who met Audie Murphy for the first time and were familiar with his exploits in the war were surprised to find the most decorated soldier in American history to be quiet and withdrawn, to be shy and humble. Murphy felt he had made no conscious choice to be heroic. He had simply done what had to be done, just as all his buddies did. He did not want to talk about it, in part because he had a survivor's guilt over the many other brave soldiers who had not beaten the law of averages as he had, and who had paid the ultimate price. In the impressive combat record of the men of Murphy's regiment is written the grim fact that it was on the front lines for so long, engaged with the enemy for months on end. In his Company B, almost all the men who started out with him were gone by the end of the war. To Murphy, survival could seem less a matter of heroic effort and more a matter of chance. In what way could that be worthy of celebration? As he said many times, the real heroes were dead. In August 1955, a newspaper columnist noted that every schoolboy able to utter the syllables can identify Audie Murphy as the most decorated GI of World War II. 60 years on from that, and 70 after the end of the war, the children and grandchildren of those schoolboys now have no idea who he was. Audie Murphy reminds us of the lingering human cost of any war, even one whose end was so triumphant as World War II. Hero that he surely was, movie star that he became, he never emerged from under the shadow of the war that made him famous. And I think it's important to note that he always was he didn't like the attention of being a hero. That he always struggled with, and just like he said, he felt guilt for surviving when so many didn't. We think about some of the stories that we just read and the things that he did that could be looked at as foolhardy and crazy to charge a machine gun nest and take it out by yourself and then pick up that machine gun and go take out the other ones. It wasn't too different from what that other officer had done, where he charged those machine gun nests and didn't survive. Although he did make it possible for the rest of his company to take out what was there, he did not survive. And Murphy, looking at situations like that over and over again, he did win out in the law of averages. He was wounded several times, spent many weeks and months in the hospital. The second that he was back on the front lines again. That's where he felt duty bound to be. And so that speaks a lot, I think, of his character. And unfortunately, his life afterwards was very difficult. He talks about, after being in war for the last, for 3 years, being on the front lines, what do you do excitement. You know, if you're the type of person that likes an adrenaline rush and likes to be adventurous and dangerous to some degree, you might be hard pressed to find that outside of a war zone. Because of that, he did have a major gambling problem. I think that's where how he compensated and where he found that thrill, which created a lot of problems with wives, family, and financially for sure. He did very well with movies for a long time. He made a ton of movies. I think I counted over 50 movies, mostly westerns that he had done. But a lot of that money, he bought ranches. That was his thing. He loved ranching and things like that. But he would lose everything at some points in his life because of his gambling problems and things like that. Struggled with relationships. But in spite of all that, he seemed to be a very likable person. I think once you got more familiar with him, it maybe strained those relationships because of all the psychological damage that he was dealing with. But both very good reads. I highly recommend them. Again, The Price of Valor, written by David A. Smith, and To Hell and Back, written by Audie Murphy. I also recommend watching To Hell and Back, the movie starring Audie Murphy. Now, keep in mind, special effects are a little different. They're not what we're used to. The acting, in fact, is a bit different, I think, than what we're used to. But it is still, from the historical perspective and from the story being told from the first-person account, it is worth watching. Maybe read the book first and then watch the movie. Obviously, Hollywood is going to tweak some things, and it's not going to be 100% true to the book. But it was well done, and I appreciated the movie more, having read the book and having a better understanding of what was going on in the movie and things like that. He was also in Red Badge of Courage, a few war movies, but mostly westerns were kind of his gig. That's what he liked to do, and some of his stuff was much better than others as far as his acting goes and things like that. But maybe you won't want to watch all 50 movies. I probably won't, but they're worth looking at. Just to wrap things up, so Audie was, again, he was born 1925 in Texas. He died in Virginia in 1971 in a plane crash. So that was him. He had a very, very young look, and that was partly why they cast him to play himself, because he still looked like he was freaking 18-year-old after the war in the movie. So anyway, check it out. I hope that was interesting to you. I've started another book that is showing some good promise for another story time. That one will take us back to the old Wild West with a little bit of a modern twist to it also. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, go take somebody shooting and be nice to people out there.